if you want to argue that we should keep funding Ukraine, if you want to argue that we should keep supporting them into the future, 10 years like Zelensky wants, you've got to be able to show tangibly on the ground where all of the Russian advantages I've mentioned can be overcome. Because if you can't overcome their manpower, their industrial capacity, their bombing force, their air defense, and their air power, if you can't neutralize all those and show a very graphic physical path, then you cannot support this because it defies common sense and reality. You want to talk about how we can't let Russia win. I hear that. I've heard that throughout the entire 2+ years of war. We can't let Russia win. Otherwise, fill in the blank, all these bad things will happen. Here's what I'm saying is, if you keep going down this path of ignoring all these ground truth realities we keep talking about, not only will Russia win, we'll lose.
Everyone, my next guest is retired U.S. Army Colonel Daniel Davis, who recently joined the stage with Professor John Mearsheimer to debate on whether the U.S. government should continue funding the war in Ukraine. Currently, the United States is split in our opinion over Ukraine. After 2 years of conflict, the U.S. seems entrenched in yet another forever war, and those who propose supporting Ukraine usually do so in the name of democracy and freedom. The theory U.S. politicians are promoting is that if Putin is not defeated, he will militarily expand his efforts beyond Ukraine, and the whole of Europe, and maybe even the world, could be in trouble. But Professor Mearsheimer and my guest Colonel Davis have proved this theory is completely false, and instead look at the cold hard facts of the situation. Ukraine is outnumbered 10-1 with artillery, but the lack of manpower is the real issue the country faces in this war. In today's episode, we discuss what the new $61 billion aid deal will do for Ukraine. We disprove the theory that Russia wants to invade Western Europe, and we bring you the most common sense and rational insights into the Ukraine-Russia conflict that you simply can't find on mainstream media. Let's begin. Daniel, you were an amazing guest a couple months ago. I had so many fans reach out and say they wanted a second interview with you. So welcome back to the show.
Privileged to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me back.
So Danny, I want to talk about Russia-Ukraine, because this is a conflict that continues to escalate. It continues to be prolonged. And I think we're now really staring at the reality that there is nothing more left than the probability of a Russian victory, either sometime this year or maybe early 25. I mean, you are a military strategist. You've obviously served in the U.S. military for many years, won 2 Bronze Stars. You have an incredible experience and insight. So as of today, what is your assessment of what's going on in Ukraine?
Look, this situation here is egregious for me to watch unfold. I fought in an armored warfare in Desert Storm in a big tank battle, was in an armored cav regiment that actually actively patrolled the east-west border during the Cold War, where we had to study Soviet tactics and always be ready for large-scale operations. I was the second in command of an armored cav squadron for the U.S. 1st Armored Division in the mid-2000s, and we trained our troops, and what I understand very, very intimately what it takes to build a cohesive unit, what it takes to survive and succeed in combat. I understand, the Russian doctrine. I understand how they fight. I know that territory very well. It's very similar in that part of Europe as it was in Germany. And I can just tell you there is absolutely zero chance that Ukraine will ever succeed in its war. I have been saying that really since the outset, because there's very fundamental reasons why. Now then, what I'm saying is, I don't see any chance that Ukraine can avoid defeat. If before there might have been a chance to where they could have, kind of had a stalemate or made it so expensive on Russia that they would have a negotiated settlement that was at least partially on Kiev's positions and would be beneficial to them. Now then, that's almost gone. And now then, the situation right now in early May of 2024 is Ukraine's choice, in my estimation, is either seek a negotiated settlement on the best terms you can get, which won't be that good right now, or keep with the fiction that you're going to try and win, which Zelensky still claims that that's his objective, and you're likely to suffer an actual military defeat. And I agree with you. I believe that as of, maybe even before the end of the summer, you could have a major break of the Ukrainian army. There's very specific reasons I say this. And once there's a major break somewhere, the whole army doesn't have to collapse. But if you get a collapse in one part of the formation and Russia exploits that and rolls in with strategic reserves that can exploit the breakthrough, then you could have the cascading collapse of the entire army here. That's what's at stake.
Yeah, Danny, I think there's some interesting data that's coming out of Ukraine. I mean, even Zelensky last month had admitted that they are outnumbered 10-1 as far as artillery. So the Russians have a 10-1 advantage in that. That's obviously why we saw this $61 billion aid package passed by the US government. But tell us a little bit more, because I don't think that's the main issue. I mean, obviously they're down 10-1 as far as artillery, but it's actually manpower that's actually Ukraine's weakest link right now. Is that correct?
That is correct. It has always been about men, not machines, not money. You can't fight a war without money, without machines. You got to have those, but you can do various things based on if you have the personnel. Ukraine doesn't have the personnel, and it's never been a fair fight. Ukraine performed heroically, spectacularly, especially in the first year of the war, way above anybody's expectations, above my expectations. But here's the problem with those. That gave false hope that they could win, because even that bad performance by Russia in the beginning and the exceptional performance by Ukraine in the first year, it doesn't change demographics. It doesn't change the population. Russia has millions more men of military age from which to draw. And for Russia, this is an existential fight. I've heard many people try to say, oh, well, the North Vietnamese eventually outlasted the United States. Even though they didn't win on the battlefield, they eventually outlasted the United States. The Taliban outlasted the United States. Obviously, a huge disparity. So too can the Ukrainians. Here's where that falls apart. In both of those cases, the American army was fighting a war halfway around the world that nobody in the country thought was needed to fight. Everybody thought it was silly. That's not the case for Russia. It's next door. It's on the front porch, not the backyard even. And it is viewed by them as an existential battle because they believe it's the West and 50 nations of NATO and several others that are all allied against them. So they will fight this to the bitter end. And so their morale is plenty high. The population is supporting the war. This is not going to be like Vietnam or Afghanistan. Russia will keep fighting until they finally grind down Ukraine into nothing. And the numbers just don't bear up Ukraine surviving.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. I didn't actually think about that, because when we look at the Vietnam War, it's obviously, we had to withdraw because of the public opinion in the United States, right? I mean, there's so many people that were against that war, seeing innocent American lives being lost for what reason. And ultimately, that's why we withdrew. You make the same case for the Taliban and Afghanistan, and why the U.S. withdrew as well. This just was a lost cause. But I think what's interesting is a lot of people don't respect Russia's opinion here that this is an existential threat. But I mean, Russia's a sovereign country, and what they deem to be existential is their opinion. And that's exactly what it is. And I think that's an important thing for people to note. Like you said, the actual Russian people are very united in this. They're very frustrated. And I think there's a lot of support actually to this conflict, wanting to see this end. This is really interesting, Danny. But let's go on to the next point, which is talking about this $61 billion aid package. Tell us a little bit more about what the U.S. Congress has just passed and how that's going to work.
Yeah, I've got a couple of problems with this. Number one is that I have been seeing politicians for months say that, the reason why Ukraine is losing on the battlefield is because the U.S. Congress is delaying passing this bill. And they're saying, that's going to make all the difference in the world. And because they don't have ammunition and weapons, especially artillery, as you pointed out, that's why they've been backing off. And everything hinges on the U.S. passing this budget. Here's what no one paid attention to. The Czech Republic has been doing this operation here for many months now, to where they say they're going to get over 1 million artillery shells, scouring the world to try to get them and to feed them into Ukraine. And they've been succeeding. I think it's several 100,000 that they produced so far. I want to say 350,000 more are coming. So if you're already getting 350,000, I think within this year, I think it's just been this calendar year, and that's not changing the ratio that you talked about there, the 1 to 10. Why does anybody think that something from the United States is going to do something materially different? It's not going to. So my first problem is this budget does not do what people think it's going to do. You had the Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin, who bragged upon the publication of this once it finally passed the House. And he said, hey, 50 billion of this is actually going to America and to our jobs. I think like 18 billion or something is going to U.S. operations, military operations in Europe, our operations. Another 12, 13 billion is going to replenish what we have already sent, for our own stocks. Only 13.8 billion was said it's going to go directly to Ukraine. The first billion that went, there was this big long list published by the State Department. They didn't give any numbers for anything, but there's a bunch of categories of stuff. Well, that tells you there's not many of any one of these categories. So it's going to be a paltry paltry amount of all the things that they need, and it's not going to change the ratio, the dynamics, and it's not going to do anything to solve the manpower problem. And
Right.
that's where the biggest problem lies right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I don't think a lot of people understand that. I was actually listening to a clip from John Mearsheimer, your good friend that you've also had a debate on. We're going to get into that discussion in a little bit. But he had said I think it's 28 out of the 61. So almost, certainly a very large portion of that is just going to be allocated to replenishing the weapons in the United States. So, that money actually is just going to be going to the military industrial complex in the U.S., funding our weapon manufacturers to replenish our own stock. It's not going to Ukraine. It's going right back to America. And interesting enough as well, I mean, obviously there was a long delay. I think the last aid package that was passed was December 2022, so it's almost a 16-month gap. And this one might be the last one because I don't think that if Donald Trump wins the presidency, I don't believe that he's going to pass another aid package. Certainly if the Republicans take control of the Senate again. And even if Biden were to win a second term, I don't think American opinion is really going to support sending more money to Ukraine. I mean, is this something we want to be doing on an annual basis? Do we want to be sending $60 billion a year?
Here's the compounding problem with that.
Yeah.
Even the people that have passed this said this is going to help them. Biden said this is going to help them hold the line through the end of the year. Well, that necessarily means that they're going to need another one later this year. We're talking months away. They're going to be asking for another one. Zelensky on the 28th of April said he's looking for a 10-year commitment from the United States. Jeez. And I, like you, Cyrus, I don't see it. I don't see the American people or Congress signing up for literally a forever war to keep that thing going on.
Yeah, it's really tough because I think when you look at, again, I like to always quote John Mearsheimer because I think he's one of the most brilliant voices on this. I always refer back to a YouTube video that he made. It was a speech that he had given back in 2015 where he predicted exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? He said, if
I've cited that on our show before. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's amazing, but it was just so well said because it's very clear. If we push Ukraine down this road, we are going to be in a situation where Ukraine will get wrecked. And again, once again, the United States is involved in another forever war, which, that's just seems to be our MO right now. We just cannot get out of these forever wars. We're constantly involved in so many things, but yet our own country, and their own citizens are not reaping the benefits of having a government that has money to spend. It's frustrating. I cannot see the American public wanting to support this war any much longer. I mean, there was already a large amount of people not happy with this being passed here in early 2024.
Yeah, and you had one of the Republican senators that did vote against it that you cited a second ago, J.D. Vance. He specified it. This is not like just because I'm against Ukraine. He said I'm not. He said, but it's a capacity issue. He said, for example, the interceptor missiles, which are absolutely essential to allowing, or that's allowing the Russian side to use air power so effectively and devastatingly against Ukraine, is because there's not enough interceptor missiles on the other side. Well, he said this aid package is going to put in a long-term contracts to expand the capacity, but he said it's going to expand it from 500 missiles a year to 600 missiles a year. So it's still a very small amount. And one of these, it doesn't take more than a few of these attacks by Russia to eat those missiles up. They go like that, and they're so expensive. So it's only going to increase the capacity by this much, and the need is this much. So the numbers and the math, it just doesn't add up.
And I think we just have to go back to that main point that you had brought up, is that it doesn't matter. We can theoretically, we could supply them an endless amount of money and weapons, but if you don't have the manpower, there's nothing that we can do. We're not going to put NATO troops on the ground. We're certainly not going to risk American lives and put American troops on the ground. Without that, without more bodies, how can you win this war? Like you said, money and equipment is needed, but nothing more important than actual people. And you're going against Russia, who has millions more. And basically, I think they're at a point where they're probably feeling very confident that they will win this war, and just know that patience is needed right now.
And Cyrus, I saw on a Ukrainian, no, I'm sorry, it was a Russian Telegram channel yesterday, something that was just really, really hard for me to watch. There was Russia has, of course, they took Avdiivka not long ago. Now they're continuing to move further to the west. One of the areas near there was called a place called Berdichi, and it was basically a forest line that Ukraine had been operating in. And after Russia captured it, one of their soldiers went in there with a camera, and it's a 6-minute video where the guy's just walking down this entire tree line, the forest where the Ukraine side had been holding out. And all you see is this unbelievable littering of Ukrainian soldiers everywhere. And you see that they didn't have a good defensive position, which is alarming because that tells you that on the front line, they don't have these good defensive positions. And that's why Russia's continuing to move on. The second thing that is a military I saw is that this is the Russian firepower going in. And it wasn't just artillery. It was their big FAB bombs that they now have, these glide bombs, and they call the toss flamethrower systems, which is a thermobaric explosion. And these people were just obliterated, and the trees were just, big, thick trees were looked into matchsticks, just shattered everywhere because of this. Meaning Russia didn't have to storm the line to take it. There weren't a lot, it wasn't an infantry battle. So all these guys died just sitting in their holes. That's why the casualty count is so high on the Ukraine side, and it's much lower than the West claims on the Russian side, because they don't have to close with them to destroy them.
Right. Yeah, it's a tragedy. I mean, there's so many young men and women that have lost their lives in Ukraine. And I think, Zelensky had lowered the age of commitment as well. I mean, he's trying to get as many more younger Ukrainians in. But again, that it sounds like to me as well, what you're talking about is also a lack of training and probably that military knowledge.
Yeah, they don't have a chance to do that. They just mobilize them. They can't mobilize enough. So they're not, the people that they are forced to mobilizing aren't enough to offset the losses. And that's why this is so egregious to me, because Zelensky is lowering the age to get more men in there. Towards what end? Yeah. There's no rational path to throw it around. Why do you want to keep throwing your men into a losing battle that it just can't be turned around rationally? I just do not understand it.
I agree with you. Danny, I want to switch a little directions here, because I think one of the factors that led to the passage of this bill was a theory that basically, Russia and specifically Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. He wants to, first he's going to take over Eastern Ukraine, which he's done, those regions. Next, he's going to go Western Ukraine. Then he's going to go into the former Baltic states. Then he's going to go into Eastern Europe, then Western Europe. And he's going to go on this, raging war path. Yeah. And I think I'm going to say this out loud. I think this is a lie that's been propagandized to the American public, because I don't think that that's Russia's intentions at all. But yet that is probably the theory that needs to be spread. That way we can justify sending another $61 billion. I want to know your thoughts on that theory. Is Putin really wanting to conquer Europe? Is that his end goal here? Or does he simply just is it really just all about Ukraine and the existential threat that NATO membership poses to Russia?
Cyrus, it is a lie. It is a known lie. It's not a theory. It is a fact. And here's why I say that with such confidence and authority. First of all, let's look at the capacity issue. I don't care what anybody says. I care what they can do. What do they have the capacity to do? For example, Hitler in the early part of the World War II, had millions of men under arms. They had an industrial capacity that could crank out all kinds of tanks and airplanes and everything else. And he had the capacity to take the whole continent. So when he was telling Lord Chamberlain in 1938 that he's not going to do anything and you should trust me and sign this piece of paper, the famous, deal where he basically, was appeasement. That's what everybody talks about all the time. Hitler had the capacity to make good on that. He had said that he had a continental wide desire. So he had the desire and he had the capacity. So it was not real smart to sign away and pretend like nothing's going to happen. This is not 1938 anymore. Vladimir Putin, even if you think he's as evil as Adolf Hitler, it does not have his capacity. So first point is, if you look at what Russia has in tanks and artillery pieces and air power, missile capacity, all those things, and how many men they have under arms, what is the total size of their force? Then you look at what it would take to actually make good on all those things that you just said people are warning about, of going into the Baltics and then into anywhere else. It doesn't exist. And the biggest shortfall in that is not even the number of troops. It's their ability to project power. It's their logistics system. It can go maybe 90 miles before it runs out. And they have to have the system that they designed, it runs on railroads. And the rail lines in the Russian side are not the same as in the European side. Ergo, that they can only go about 90 miles past the last train station they have. Right. Once you run out of that, they can't go any further. But even if Putin had those desires, which he doesn't, he can't make good on them. Here's the kicker. people in the West, the leaders know this. I talked to somebody in Europe last week who has access to know some of the people in some of these other countries. And I point blank asked him, I said, do they actually believe what they're saying in public? Because I see many people in the Baltics make these claims. And he says, no, they all know that. Every one of them know that. But they also they have a fearful public, so they want to say these things to make them support giving more defense for their own buildup. So they want to expand their national security capacity, et cetera. So they know that that's nonsense, but they say it anyway because it works and it does get them the money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the issue that I think we really use. I think the U.S. government uses this theory in a lot of ways, right? It's the same way that we say, hey, China's going to invade Taiwan at any minute, so let's send more money to there. If we don't support Israel and we send them billions more, it's gonna expand into this. And certainly, I like your point on the capacity issue, and I think that's a big one because, like you said, even if Putin did have those ambitions, it would not be feasible. And you compare that to Hitler back in the day, who had those ambitions and it was very feasible. He had the capacity to actually pull it off. And so I think that theory doesn't check out. I think that is completely propaganda.
Well, and we have to add on to that Putin does say the opposite. He has said since 2007 that he wants security on his border. He has never said anything besides he wants a negotiated deal with Ukraine. And he doesn't want to have to militarily defeat them. He said that, even recently in that Tucker Carlson interview, he again said, I'm willing to negotiate, but they have a law preventing negotiations right now. So it's not him. He doesn't want to go further. He just wants to end the war and have security.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. And also just some common sense here, Danny, because obviously if Putin were to invade Western Europe or even the Baltic states, I mean, several of them are members of NATO. So obviously you have the Article 5 that would immediately be implemented. And then now all of a sudden you have Russia versus the United States in a military conflict, both nuclear powers. That's not something that Russia wants either.
And look, you're 100% right. You did absolutely hit it on the head. Putin acknowledges out loud what you just said. He said, we don't have anywhere near the capacity conventionally to go against NATO. So we would never try then. But if NATO tries, then I don't have the capacity either. So it's going to go nuclear. So as long as you want to avoid nuclear war, don't have this war. He knows that. He's not suicidal. He's very rational. However, if you think he's evil or whatever, people can think whatever they want, but he's definitely not stupid or suicidal.
No. And I don't think I think this is just really all about Ukraine, and it's been that way. And he's been preaching that message for many years. And I think a difficult one for Europe is the fact that, they're caught in a very difficult situation because the United States guarantees security for Europe, right? Europe would not be as strong today if it was not for the United States military guaranteeing that security. But at the same standpoint, because the U.S. offers security, you now have to go with the United States policy. And we saw that with, Merkel? She was very much, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and the French president at the time. They both had spoken out and said, look, we don't want Ukraine to go towards NATO membership. But of course, the United States overruled them and said, no, we're going to push forward this. So again, it's the Europeans that suffer, but they can't really say anything to the United States because ultimately the U.S. government controls their security. So it's kind of a catch-22 really for Europe, because in one sense, you certainly want to have the United States guaranteeing your security, but as a result, you do give up your freedom because you're going to have to basically fall in line and do whatever the United States government says, which has now put Europe in a very difficult spot.
One has to ask, why would we want to put Europe in a difficult spot? This war could absolutely have been avoided. There was every chance in the world. I wrote about this starting 7 months before the war. I kept writing over and over about how we're getting closer and closer, and Russia means what it says, and it is willing to use force if we keep pushing ahead in this. There was never any reason to keep pushing NATO further and further toward their border. Russia can't make good on it. There's no threat from Russia. It's not the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which had 50,000 tanks and nuclear weapons and thousands of fighters. This is not the same threat, so it's not needed. But we kept going forward anyway, and now we have the war that we should have been able to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel, let's shift topics here, because we're talking about the war that we should have been able to avoid. Recently, you and John Mearsheimer were on a debate team, and you were debating at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I think this was an interesting one because the debate topic was, should the United States continue to fund this war? Obviously, you and Mearsheimer took the stance that the United States should not continue funding this war. Tell me a little bit about that experience and, how that debate debate went and how that entire thing went down.
Well, first of all, it was a real treat and pleasure to get to debate alongside John Mearsheimer, who's, as you pointed out, going back to 2015, and actually he wrote some stuff even earlier than that, predicting many years before that, predicting that there was a risk of war with Russia, even before the events of the Maidan in the 2014, et cetera. So it was a real pleasure to get to stand alongside of him because of his track record. And I actually didn't know until then that he was a former Army guy, a West Point grad. I thought he was just a brilliant professor. So
nice.
That was interesting by itself. But once we got on the stage, the one thing that really stood out to both of us was that all of our arguments are based on a ground truth assessment of what's reality, what's true on the ground. And aside from whatever people say, the other side's argument was all about emotions and headlines. And in fact, when we tried to steer the argument into facts and counting things and tanks and bullets and manpower and all those things, they did not defend their position based on that. So here's the key thing that anyone on that's debating this issue has to understand. If you want to argue that we should keep funding Ukraine, if you want to argue that we should keep supporting them into the future, 10 years like Zelensky wants, you've got to be able to show tangibly on the ground where all of the Russian advantages I've mentioned can be overcome. Because if you can't overcome their manpower, their industrial capacity, their bombing force, their air defense, and their air power, if you can't neutralize all those and show a very graphic physical path, then you cannot support this, because it defies common sense and reality that they can't win if you can't do that. And there is no such path, and nor do they try to make that argument. They use this stuff that, democracy, we're defending democracy, and, it's unjust what happened to them. And it is. They were invaded. It was unjust. I agree with that. But those things don't matter, because war doesn't care about morality. War doesn't care about what's right and wrong. It cares about who's got more bullets, bombs, and bodies than the other side. That's what it cares about. So if you care about the people, then you want to bring that war to an end as soon as possible to preserve as much land as possible, much freedom as possible, and drop the killing to the people you care about. And we're not doing any of those.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very common sense point there, Danny. I mean, war does not care about your feelings. It's a fact, right? It's who has more. When you have President Zelensky admitting, look, we're at a 10-1 deficit right now. We're 1, they're 10 as far as artillery. In addition, we have no more men to serve. I mean, when you're looking at the cold, hard facts, you have to make a very blunt and honest assessment on what's happening. And I salute you guys for doing that, because, even on this YouTube channel, sometimes people will say, hey, you're taking the Russian talking points. And I say, no, what I do is I contact brilliant minds like yourself, Mearsheimer. I want to get these insights from people that just simply look at the facts of the situation. And, just because we're analyzing it and saying, look, a Russian victory seems imminent, it's just more from looking at it from a military strategist mindset. Let's look at the facts of the situation and see what is logistically going to happen. When you're down 10-1, when that new aid package passes, but yet half of it is still going to be sent to the military industrial complex in the United States, basically just replacing all the weapons that we've sent over, it doesn't look good. And I love your point there saying that, look, if we're going to support for 10 years, show me on paper at which point does it become where we can overtake Russia? Like where does the scales then tip in the opposite direction? They can't, and that's why I think the only counter debate really is one based on emotion. But, you cannot use emotion when you're talking about complex geopolitics and specifically war.
And, and I would add in there on the emotional argument, I also have one. And here it is. You want to talk about how we can't let Russia win. I hear that. I've heard that throughout the entire 2+ years of war. We can't let Russia win. Otherwise, fill in the blank, all these bad things will happen. Here's what I'm saying is, if you keep going down this path of ignoring all these ground truth realities we keep talking about, not only will Russia win, we'll lose. And I assure you, if you think that it was bad to let Putin win, meaning have a negotiated settlement where he ends up with territory that he didn't start the war with, and who in the West would argue that that's not a good thing for Russia. But if you say, because I don't want that one, I'm going to keep fighting, that implies that you think you can win.
Right.
But if the path is that you can't, then the likely outcome is that you will lose even more. And that's where it's going to really cut our credibility, because imagine if NATO, the whole force, is shown to have been unable to stop Russia from winning. Now then our credibility is really damaged, far worse than having a negotiated settlement.
Danny, do you feel that that credibility, would that show weakness on the international stage? Would that just make NATO and the United States look completely useless?
If we lose, it will. If
Yeah.
we do the right thing, the rational thing, and say, all right, we're going to recognize reality and we're going to stop doing things that are dumb, that are going to potentially lead to failure. Let's try to bring this to an end right now. Then it's going to look bad because it took us 2.5 years to get to someplace we could have done before the war. But at least people go, all right, well, they finally got there. And they do have a lot of power. They do have, strong NATO, air defenses, air power, naval power, all kinds of things. All that's still intact. So you still have deterrence there. Russia doesn't have the capacity to go further. So it'll be embarrassing. But at the end of the day, all the power remains intact. But if you don't do that and Russia ends up winning, now then people will, even in the West, will start saying, what good is NATO? And then you have the real chance that it could actually fall apart.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. Danny, I'm going to have one final question as we wrap up today's interview. First of all, I want to, again, thank you for your time and your insights. It's fantastic. We're going to keep getting you on the show and breaking down these. I just love chatting with you about this stuff. But do you think that now looking at a little bit more broader picture, looking at that we have a conflict that we're very much involved in Ukraine, we continue to fund Israel in this war that does not seem to be ending anytime soon as well, the war in Gaza. We've got Africa's on fire right now. We've got, the Taliban's back in control in Afghanistan. You've got the U.S. really wanting to now stir up a hornet's nest with China. What is your kind of feelings right now as we're also, the other one is the X factor, the 2024 election? What is your feeling for the nation of America right now? The United States, I should say.
Yeah. I actually had Ambassador Chaz Freeman on my show recently, and I asked him nearly that same question. And, as someone who was in the diplomatic corps for, I think, like 40 something years of his life at some of the highest levels, he's just anguished by what he sees. And even though I haven't been in the diplomatic corps, I'm anguished by what I see too. And you really painted that global picture pretty starkly and unpleasantly accurate, in that we keep making lots of mistakes and going down paths that just can't succeed. And at some point we could have a break to where, whether it's the Ukraine side loses, or God forbid, if we ever, provoke China into a fight that I don't think we can even win in the Indo-Pacific, or any of these other things, we keep undercutting our own credibility, because right now we are throwing away centuries of credibility and power built up by the United States by making so many foolish decisions, such that it's not just whether China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran are going to do something nefarious diplomatically or militarily, but it's like even in the global South, even in the West, people are starting to look already at the United States like, what is wrong with you guys? You keep doing dumb things. That means that they're not going to listen to us. They're not going to moderate their behavior. They're not going to do things that ultimately would be in our advantage. And that's a very dangerous place to get in, because if people start turning their back on you, especially from inside, then the risk that others on the outside start doing stuff rises. And that's bad for everybody.
Yeah, it really is. Well, Danny, that's why we talk about these things, because we want to spread more public knowledge about this, and hopefully, interviews like this and YouTube channels like ours can, help educate the public and really, try to make a difference. I mean, we're going to go to the polls in November. I don't think we have a good choice with both candidates. I mean, wouldn't be my ideal choice, either of them, but yet that's where we are. So we're going to have to do the best that we can and see, hopefully just pray for better leadership and some sound, cool heads to prevail, and some better strategic thinking. So I want to thank you again. Thank you for your time. And everybody, I'm going to also put a link down to Danny's YouTube channel. It's growing very fast. He's doing a great job. Danny, congrats on the growth of your channel. We're going to put a link down to that in the description down below. And everyone, thank you for your amazing support, making it all the way to this point of the video. And we can't wait to share more interviews like this with you very soon.